smell of motor oil and old coffee filled the small auto repair shop as David wiped his greasy hands on a torn rag. The clock on the wall showed 4:30 p.m., and he was already thinking about picking up his 7-year-old daughter from the after-school program. Money was tight, tighter than it had ever been, and the after-school care was eating into what little he had left each month. His daughter Lucy sat in the corner of the shop, her small legs swinging from an old office chair as she worked on her homework. The math problem seemed to give her trouble, and David made a mental note to help her after dinner. That is, if they had dinner. The refrigerator at home was nearly empty and payday was still 3 days away. The repair shop had been his dream once. After his wife died 2 years ago, David thought running his own business would give him the freedom to be there for Lucy. What he didn't expect was how hard it would be to keep customers happy, pay the bills and raise a child all at the same time. Most days he felt like he was drowning. "Daddy, I'm hungry," Lucy said without looking up from her homework. "I know, sweetheart. We'll go home soon and make something good," David replied, though he wasn't sure what that something would be. The last of the sandwich meat had gone into her lunch that morning. The phone rang, but David let it go to voicemail. It was probably another bill collector, and he didn't have the energy to explain why the payment would be late again. The shop's rent was already a month behind, and the landlord had made it clear that patience was running out. David looked around the shop that had become both his hope and his burden. The tools were old but reliable. Most of them bought secondhand when he first opened. The lift had a slow leak that he couldn't afford to fix properly, so he had to pump it up every morning. The waiting area consisted of 3 mismatched chairs and a coffee table covered in magazines from 2019. But it was his, and more importantly, it was Lucy's future. At least that's what he told himself during the sleepless nights when bills piled up on the kitchen table. The sound of a sputtering engine outside caught his attention. Through the large window, he could see an old pickup truck barely making it into the parking lot. Steam poured from under the hood, and the engine made sounds that no engine should ever make. David grabbed his jacket and headed outside. The driver's door creaked open, and out stepped a woman who looked to be in her early 50s. She wore faded jeans with patches on the knees and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. Her boots were caked with mud, and her gray hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked like someone who worked with her hands for a living. "Afternoon," she said with a tired smile. "I'm Mary. This old girl decided to give up on me about a mile down the road. Barely made it here." David walked around the truck, noting the steam and the puddle of coolant already forming beneath it. The vehicle had to be at least 20 years old, with rust spots and dents that spoke of hard use. But he could tell it had been maintained as well as possible given its age. "Let me take a look," David said, popping the hood. The sight that greeted him wasn't good. The radiator was cracked, coolant was everywhere, and from the sound the engine had been making, he suspected much worse problems lurking beneath. Mary stood beside him, her arms crossed as she watched him examine the damage. "How bad is it, Doc?" David wiped his hands and looked at her honestly. "Well, the radiator's done for sure, but that knocking sound tells me you might have a blown head gasket too, and the way it was shifting when you pulled in suggests transmission problems." Mary's face fell. "What's that mean in dollars?" David did quick math in his head. Parts alone would run close to $2,000, maybe more. With labor, he'd normally charge around $2,800 for a job like this. But looking at Mary's clothes and the worry lines on her face, he could tell money was as tight for her as it was for him. "Honestly, you're looking at about $2,800 to do it right." Mary let out a long breath and leaned against the truck. "That might as well be $28,000 for all the good it does me." She looked at the truck like it was an old friend she was about to lose. "This old thing is how I make my living. Without it, I can't get to the feed store, can't haul supplies to my farm, can't do much of anything." David understood that feeling completely. When you're living paycheck to paycheck, losing your transportation isn't just an inconvenience, it's a disaster. "What kind of farming do you do?" David asked. "Little bit of everything. Some cattle. Grow what crops I can on the land I've got. It's not much, but it keeps me going." Mary kicked at a loose stone in the parking lot. "Been doing it for 20-odd years now. Love the work, but the money's never been easy." Inside the shop, Lucy had stopped doing homework and was watching through the window. David could see her curious expression as she observed the conversation. She'd always been interested in people, asking questions about the customers who came and went. "Tell you what," David heard himself saying before he'd really thought it through. "What if we just charge you for parts? I could do the labor for free. Mary's head snapped up. You can't do that. That's no way to run a business. Maybe not, David admitted. But I know what it's like to need a break sometimes. The truth was, David couldn't really afford to work for free. Every hour he spent on Mary's truck without pay was an hour he wouldn't be earning money his family desperately needed. But something about her reminded him of himself. Working hard, doing everything right, and still struggling to get by. Mary studied his face carefully. Why would you do that for someone you just met? David glanced back at Lucy through the window. Because somebody did something like that for me once when I really needed it. And because sometimes doing the right thing is more important than doing the profitable thing. Mary was quiet for a long moment. That's real kind of you, but I can't let you work for nothing. How about we split the difference? I'll pay for parts and half the labor. David considered this. It still meant he'd be working at a loss, but it was better than nothing. And something told him that Mary needed this help more than he needed the full payment. Deal, he said, extending his hand. Mary shook it firmly. I appreciate this more than you know. When can you get started? I can order the parts tomorrow morning. Should have everything by Friday and get you back on the road by Saturday. As Mary prepared to leave, she noticed Lucy watching from inside. That's your daughter? Yeah, that's Lucy. She hangs out here after school while I work. She's beautiful. You're doing a good job with her. David felt a warmth in his chest. Compliments about his parenting meant everything to him these days. Thank you. It's not always easy, but she's the best thing in my life. Mary smiled and headed toward the road to call someone for a ride. As David watched her go, he wondered if he'd just made a huge mistake. But looking at Lucy's proud smile through the window, he decided that some mistakes were worth making. The next morning, David was on the phone with parts suppliers before 8 o'clock. Finding affordable parts for Mary's old truck wasn't easy, but he made call after call until he found what he needed at prices that wouldn't break either of their budgets. By noon, he had everything ordered and scheduled for Friday delivery. Lucy was at school, so the shop felt unusually quiet as David worked on other customers' cars. A brake job here, an oil change there. Small jobs that kept the lights on but barely covered expenses. Every few minutes his mind wandered back to Mary's truck and the work he'd committed to doing, mostly for free. Around 3 o'clock, he heard footsteps outside and looked up to see Mary walking toward the shop. She carried a brown paper bag and wore the same work clothes as the day before, though they looked freshly washed. Thought you might be hungry, she said, setting the bag on his workbench. Made some extra sandwiches this morning. David wiped his hands and opened the bag. Inside were 2 thick sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, along with a thermos of what smelled like fresh coffee. His stomach reminded him that lunch had been a luxury he'd skipped to save money. You didn't have to do this, he said, though he was already unwrapping one of the sandwiches. Course I did. You're helping me out. Least I can do is make sure you don't starve while you're doing it. Mary poured coffee into the thermos cap and handed it to him. Besides, I was coming this way anyway. Had to check on some things in town. The sandwich was incredible. Thick sliced turkey with fresh vegetables and some kind of spread that made his mouth water. David realized he hadn't eaten anything this good in weeks. Usually meals at home were whatever was cheapest at the grocery store. This is amazing, he said between bites. Where'd you learn to cook like this? Mary laughed. When you live alone on a farm, you either learn to cook or you eat a lot of bad food. I chose to learn. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, David eating gratefully while Mary looked around the shop. She seemed genuinely interested in his work, asking questions about different tools and the cars he was fixing. How long you been doing this? She asked. About 3 years now. Always worked on cars, but opening my own place was something I dreamed about for a long time. David took a sip of the coffee, which was better than anything he'd had in months. My wife used to say I spent more time under the hood of a car than I did in the house. Used to? David's expression grew quiet. She passed away 2 years ago. Can't say. That's when I decided to finally open this place. Figured being my own boss would let me spend more time with Lucy. Mary nodded slowly. That's hard, real hard. You're doing right by your daughter, though. Can see it in how she looks at you. Something about Mary's gentle way of speaking made David feel comfortable sharing things he rarely talked about. Maybe it was because she seemed to understand struggle. Or maybe it was just the kindness in her eyes. Some days I wonder if I'm doing anything right, he admitted. The bills keep piling up and I feel like I'm always one step behind. Lucy deserves better than this. That little girl's got a daddy who works hard and cares about her. That's worth more than all the money in the world. Mary finished her coffee and stood up. Trust me on that one. Friday came faster than David expected and the parts arrived right on schedule. Mary showed up just as the delivery truck was pulling away along with Lucy, who'd just gotten out of school. "Miss Mary," Lucy called out, running over with her backpack bouncing. "Well, hello there, Lucy. How was school today?" "Good. We learned about farms in science class." "Did you know cows have 4 stomachs?" Mary grinned. "I did know that. Pretty amazing, isn't it? They're smarter than most people think, too." David watched the interaction with surprise. Lucy was usually shy around strangers, but she seemed drawn to Mary immediately. The older woman had a natural way with children, listening to Lucy's chatter about school as if it was the most important conversation in the world. "Can I help Daddy fix your truck?" Lucy asked. "That's up to your daddy, but I think an extra pair of hands would be mighty helpful." David spent the weekend working on Mary's truck with Lucy as his eager assistant. She couldn't do much actual work, but she handed him tools and asked endless questions about engines and how things worked. Mary would stop by each day, bringing food and stories that kept them all entertained. The stories were what surprised David most. Mary talked about her farm like it was a living thing, the way the seasons changed the land, how each animal had its own personality, the satisfaction of watching crops grow from seeds to harvest. She painted pictures with her words that made Lucy's eyes light up with wonder. "I bet you've got some interesting animals," Lucy said on Saturday afternoon while David worked under the hood. "Oh, I do. Got this one cow named Buttercup who thinks she's a dog. Follows me around everywhere, tries to come in the house when it rains." Mary chuckled. "And there's this old rooster who's convinced he runs the whole place. Struts around like he owns everything." "Do you have horses?" Lucy asked hopefully. "Few of them. There's this one mare, sweetest thing you ever saw. Her name's Honey, and she loves apples more than anything in the world." David listened to these conversations while he worked, enjoying the sound of Lucy's laughter. It had been too long since he'd heard her really excited about something. The stress of their situation had affected her too, though she tried to hide it. By Sunday evening, the truck was running better than it had in years. David had gone beyond the basic repairs, replacing worn belts and hoses, checking the brakes, and making sure everything was safe and reliable. It was more work than he'd planned, but he couldn't bring himself to cut corners when someone was depending on him. "Fire her up," he told Mary as he closed the hood. The engine turned over smoothly and settled into a steady purr. No more knocking, no more steam, no more worrying sounds. Mary revved it gently, and the truck responded perfectly. "David, this is incredible. She hasn't run this good in 5 years." Mary got out and looked at the truck with amazement. "What do I owe you?" David had done the math several times over the weekend. Parts had cost $1,400 and he'd put in nearly 20 hours of work. At his normal rate, she'd owe close to $2,500 total. But their deal was for parts plus half labor. $1,700 should cover it, he said. Mary pulled out an envelope from her jacket pocket. "I've got something for you, too." She handed Lucy a small wooden horse carved with incredible detail. "Made this myself. Thought you might like it." Lucy gasped and held the horse carefully. "It's beautiful." "Thank you, Miss Mary." "You made this?" David asked, examining the craftsmanship. The carving was professional quality with smooth lines and perfect proportions. "Hobby of mine. Helps pass the winter evenings." Mary smiled as Lucy hugged the wooden horse. "You two have been real good to me. Don't get to talk to folks much, living out where I do." "This has been nice." As Mary prepared to leave, she turned back to David. "You know, I've been thinking. I've got equipment on my farm that breaks down regular. Tractors, generators, irrigation pumps. I usually have to drive 2 hours to find someone who knows what they're doing. You interested in some extra work?" David's heart jumped. Regular work meant steady income, something he desperately needed. "I'd be very interested," he said. "Good. I'll be in touch soon." Mary climbed into her truck and rolled down the window. "And David, thank you for everything." As the truck disappeared down the road, David felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. 2 weeks passed, and David was back to his usual routine of struggling to make ends meet. The money from Mary's truck repair had helped, but it was already gone. Rent, groceries, Lucy's school supplies, and a doctor visit when she came down with a cold. The cycle never seemed to end. He was under the hood of Mrs. Peterson's sedan when he heard the familiar sound of Mary's truck pulling into the lot. David smiled despite his worries. Over the past weeks, he'd found himself looking forward to Mary's visits more than he cared to admit. There was something calming about her presence, and Lucy absolutely adored her. "Afternoon, David," Mary called out as she walked into the shop. "Got a minute to talk? Always got time for you," David said, wiping his hands on his coveralls. Lucy looked up from her homework table and waved enthusiastically. "Miss Mary, did you bring any new stories about Buttercup?" "Always do, sweetheart. But first I need to talk business with your daddy." Mary turned to David with a serious expression. "I've got a proposition for you." David felt his stomach tighten. In his experience, propositions usually meant more problems. "I've been thinking about what I mentioned last time, about needing someone to work on my farm equipment." Mary pulled out a folded paper from her jacket. "I'm talking about a real partnership here. Monthly retainer of $3,000 plus payment for each job. Guaranteed work year-round." David stared at her. $3,000 a month would change everything. That was more than he made in most months from the shop, and it would be steady income he could count on. "Mary, that's incredibly generous. But I have to ask, how can you afford something like that? I mean, farming's tough work, but that's a lot of money." Mary smiled mysteriously. "Why don't you come see my place this Saturday? Bring Lucy. I think you'll understand better once you see what we're dealing with." Saturday morning came with perfect weather. David loaded Lucy into his old Honda, and they followed Mary's directions out of town. The drive took them through rolling hills and past several small farms with modest houses and basic equipment. "I wonder if we'll see Buttercup," Lucy said excitedly from the passenger seat. "I'm sure we will, kiddo." After about 40 minutes, Mary's directions led them down a long gravel road. David expected to see a simple farmhouse and maybe a barn or two. What he saw instead made him pull over and stare. Spread out before them was one of the most impressive agricultural operations he'd ever seen. The main house was a beautiful 2-story building with wraparound porches and pristine landscaping. Beyond it stretched barn after barn, each one looking like it had been built recently and maintained perfectly. "Daddy, this place is huge," Lucy whispered. David drove slowly up the driveway, trying to take it all in. The pastures were divided by perfect fencing that seemed to go on forever. Cattle grazed in groups, and David could tell even from a distance that these weren't ordinary farm animals. They looked like prize stock. Mary was waiting for them by the main house, wearing the same simple clothes she always wore. But now, standing in front of this massive operation, something didn't add up. "Welcome to my little farm," she said with a grin that suggested she knew exactly what David was thinking. "Little farm?" David got out of the car slowly. "Mary, this place must be worth millions. Come on, let me show you around. Lucy, want to meet Buttercup?" For the next 2 hours, Mary led them through her property. David had never seen anything like it. The barns housed equipment that cost more than most people's houses. Tractors with GPS systems, automated feeding equipment, and generators that could power a small town. The cattle operation was equally impressive. Mary explained that she raised premium beef cattle, and the animals they saw were worth thousands of dollars each. The breeding program she'd developed had produced award-winning stock that sold across the country. "This one's Buttercup," Mary said, leading them to a gentle cow who did indeed act more like a dog than livestock. The animal came right up to the fence and nuzzled Mary's hand affectionately. Lucy was in heaven, petting Buttercup and asking a million questions about farm life. But David's mind was racing with confusion. "Mary, I have to ask, if you own all this, why were you so worried about fixing your truck? And why do you dress like—" He stopped, realizing how rude that sounded. Mary laughed. "Like I don't have money? That's a long story. But the short version is that I learned a long time ago that people treat you differently when they know you have wealth. They either want something from you, or they think you owe them something, or they act fake around you." She led them to a hilltop that overlooked the entire property. From here, David could see that the farm stretched much further than he'd initially realized. Solar panels covered several barn roofs, and in the distance he could see what looked like wind turbines. "I inherited this place from my uncle 25 years ago. Back then it was just a small cattle ranch, maybe 200 acres. But I had ideas about sustainable farming and renewable energy. I started investing the profits back into the land, buying adjacent properties when they came up for sale." "So why the old truck?" Why not drive something that matches all this? Because that old truck tells me who people really are, Mary said simply. When I pulled into your shop looking like just another struggling farmer, you still chose to help me. You didn't know I could pay full price, you just saw someone who needed help and decided to do the right thing. David felt a strange mix of embarrassment and pride. He'd been completely fooled, but somehow that felt okay. Besides, Mary continued, I actually do love that old truck. Been driving it for 15 years and it's never let me down. Well, except for that day it brought me to your shop. They walked through more of the property and Mary explained how the business worked. She sold cattle to premium restaurants and specialty markets. The crops she grew were organic and brought top dollar. But the real money came from her investments in agricultural technology and sustainable energy projects. I've got 3 other properties like this one, plus investments in companies that develop farming equipment and renewable energy systems, she said casually, as if she was talking about the weather. Lucy was riding on David's shoulders now, tired from all the walking but still excited about everything she'd seen. Daddy, this place is like a fairy tale. Mary smiled at that. Maybe it is, sweetheart. Sometimes good things happen to people who work hard and treat others kindly. As they walked back toward the main house, David finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been bothering him. Why me, Mary? You could hire any mechanic in the state to work on your equipment. Why offer this opportunity to someone you barely know? Mary stopped walking and looked at him seriously. Because in all my years of dealing with people, I've learned that money can't buy the most important things. It can't buy honesty or kindness or someone who'll do the right thing even when it costs them something. She gestured toward the property around them. All this means nothing if I can't trust the people I work with. When you fixed my truck for basically nothing, knowing you needed that money for your own family, you showed me who you really are. But what if I mess up? What if I can't handle equipment this expensive? Then we'll figure it out together. I didn't build all this by being afraid to take chances on good people. Mary smiled. Besides, Lucy's going to need college money someday. This partnership could set up both your futures. As they loaded back into David's car for the drive home, Lucy fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted from the day's adventures. David drove in thoughtful silence, his mind trying to process everything he'd learned. Mary followed behind them in her old truck, and seeing it now, knowing what he knew, David couldn't help but smile. She really was something special. Monday morning felt different for David. He woke up before his alarm, something that hadn't happened in months. The weekend visit to Mary's farm had left him with a strange mix of excitement and nervousness that he couldn't shake. The offer she'd made was beyond anything he'd ever imagined, but part of him wondered if it was too good to be true. Lucy bounced into the kitchen while he was making coffee, already dressed and ready for school despite being 30 minutes early. Daddy, when do we get to go back to Miss Mary's farm? I want to see if Buttercup remembers me. I'm sure she remembers you, kiddo. Animals are good at that. David poured cereal into Lucy's bowl and sat down across from her. What did you think about everything you saw yesterday? It was like a movie, but real. Miss Mary must be really smart to have all that. Lucy took a bite of cereal and looked thoughtful. Do you think we'll really get to work there? I don't know yet. We'll have to see what happens. But David was already planning in his head. If Mary's offer was genuine, it would mean steady income for the first time in years. Lucy could have the things she needed without him worrying about every dollar. Maybe they could even move to a better apartment, one where the heater worked properly and the neighbors weren't so loud. The shop felt quiet after dropping Lucy at school. David tried to focus on the brake job he'd started Friday, but his mind kept wandering. Around 10 o'clock, Mary's truck pulled into the lot and David felt his heart speed up. Morning, David. You had time to think about my offer? I've thought about nothing else, David admitted. But I have to be honest with you, Mary. I've never worked on equipment like what you have. Most of what I know is regular cars and light trucks. Mary nodded. I figured as much. That's why the first month would be training. I'd have you work alongside Tom, my current equipment manager. He's getting ready to retire, but he knows those machines better than anyone. There's a current equipment manager? Course there is. You didn't think I was handling all that maintenance myself, did you? Mary laughed. Tom's been with me for 12 years, but his wife wants to move closer to their grandkids in Florida. That's why I need someone new. This made David feel better. Learning from someone experienced would give him confidence to handle the sophisticated equipment he'd seen. What would this mean for my shop here? That's up to you. You could keep it running part-time. Maybe focus on your regular customers for weekend work. Or you could close it and focus completely on the farm operation. The monthly retainer alone would be more than you're making here. David looked around the shop that had been his dream and his struggle for 3 years. Letting it go would be scary, but maybe it was time to admit that the dream wasn't working the way he'd hoped. When would you want me to start? Soon as you're ready. Tom's planning to leave at the end of next month, so ideally we'd start your training in 2 weeks. That evening, David sat at his kitchen table with a legal pad, trying to work out the numbers. Mary's retainer would cover their basic expenses with money left over. The per-job payments would be extra income they could save or use for things Lucy needed. For the first time in years, David could imagine a future where money wasn't a constant worry. The next few days passed in a blur of preparations. David called his regular customers to explain the situation, and most were understanding. Mrs. Peterson even said she was happy for him and would be willing to wait if he wanted to continue fixing her car on weekends. Mary stopped by Wednesday with a contract that made everything official. David read through it twice, amazed at how generous the terms were. The retainer was guaranteed for 2 years with options to extend. Health insurance was included, something David hadn't had since his wife died. There was even a college fund contribution for Lucy. Mary, this is too much. You're being too generous. Let me worry about that. I've got more money than I know what to do with, and I'd rather invest it in good people than let it sit in some bank account. Friday was David's last official day at the shop, though he planned to keep it open part-time for now. Lucy came by after school to help him pack up tools and organize things for the transition. Are you sad about leaving here, Daddy? David looked around the shop that had been their life for 3 years. It held memories of struggle, but also of the day Mary first walked in and changed everything. A little sad, maybe, but mostly excited. This is going to be good for us, Lucy. Will I still get to help you work on things? Absolutely. Miss Mary said the farm always needs an extra pair of hands. The following Monday, David and Lucy drove out to Mary's farm for his first day of training. Tom turned out to be a friendly man in his 60s who'd spent his whole life around farm equipment. He had the patience of a teacher and the knowledge of someone who'd fixed everything that could break. These machines look complicated, but they're just big versions of what you already know, Tom explained as they stood next to a massive John Deere tractor. Engine's an engine, hydraulics work the same way. Electrical systems follow the same principles. David spent the morning learning about the tractor's computer systems and GPS guidance. It was far more advanced than anything he'd worked on. But Tom was right. The basic principles were familiar. Lucy spent the day with Mary, who seemed to enjoy having a curious 7-year-old asking endless questions about farm life. By lunchtime, Lucy was helping gather eggs from the chicken coop and had made friends with every animal on the property. She's a natural, Mary told David during their lunch break. Reminds me of myself at that age, always wanting to know how everything worked. She's definitely not afraid to get her hands dirty, David agreed, watching Lucy chase a chicken around the yard. The afternoon brought more training on different equipment, irrigation systems, generators, and speciale. Z harvesting machines. Each one represented tens of thousands of dollars in value, which made David nervous at first. But Tom's calm confidence was reassuring. Don't worry about breaking anything, Tom said. Mary would rather have someone who tries and makes mistakes than someone who's too scared to touch anything. By the end of the week, David was starting to feel comfortable with the basic maintenance routines. The equipment was more complex than what he was used to, but the work was satisfying in a way that oil changes and brake jobs had never been. Friday afternoon, Mary invited David and Lucy to stay for dinner. She cooked steaks on a grill overlooking the main pasture, and they ate outside as the sun set behind the hills. How's the first week been? Mary asked. Incredible. I never imagined I'd be working on machines like this. David cut a piece of steak for Lucy. Tom's a great teacher. He likes you too. Says you've got good instincts and you're not afraid to ask questions. Lucy looked up from her plate. Miss Mary, can I come help on the farm every day? Well, you've got school most days, sweetheart. But weekends and summers, I'd love to have you here. As they drove home that evening, Lucy fell asleep in the passenger seat with a smile on her face. David felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. the calm confidence that comes from knowing tomorrow would be better than today. The shop was quiet when they passed it on the way home, but David didn't feel sad anymore. It had served its purpose, bringing him to this moment when everything was about to change for the better. 1 year later, David stood in the main equipment barn watching the sunrise paint the hills golden. It was hard to believe how much had changed since that rainy day when Mary's truck had limped into his shop. The old repair shop was still there, but he only used it on weekends now for neighbors who needed small jobs done. His real work was here, managing the mechanical heart of Mary's operation. Tom had retired 6 months ago, leaving David fully in charge of maintaining millions of dollars worth of equipment. What had seemed impossible a year ago now felt natural. The computer systems that had once intimidated him were like old friends, and he could diagnose problems with the big machines almost as easily as he'd once fixed car engines. Lucy was different too. At 8 years old, she moved around the farm with the confidence of someone who belonged there. School ended at 3, and by 4 she was usually in the barn helping David or in the pastures with Mary, learning about crops and animals with the enthusiasm only a child could have. Morning. "David?" Mary called out as she walked into the barn. Even after all this time, she still wore the same simple clothes, still drove the same old truck, though David had learned it was more about comfort than deception now. Morning. "The new irrigation controller is acting up again. I think we need to replace the whole unit. Do what you think is best. You know these systems better than I do now." Mary poured herself coffee from the pot David kept in the office corner of the barn. "Actually, there's something I wanted to talk to you about." David felt a familiar flutter of nervousness. Even though their relationship had grown into genuine friendship, he still worried when Mary wanted to have serious conversations. "Lucy's getting older, and I've been thinking about her future. About both your futures, really." They walked outside where Lucy was feeding carrots to Honey, the gentle mare who'd become her special favorite. The sight of his daughter laughing as the horse nuzzled her hand never got old for David. "I've been watching you both this past year," Mary continued, "seeing how you've taken to this life, how Lucy loves being here, and I've been thinking about what happens when I'm not around anymore. Mary, you're only 53. You've got plenty of years left." "Maybe so, but I'm not getting any younger and I don't have family to leave this to." Mary leaned against the fence and watched Lucy with a soft smile. "I've been talking to my lawyer about some changes I want to make." David's stomach tightened. Changes usually meant uncertainty, and he'd grown to love the security of their arrangement. "What kind of changes?" Mary pulled a folder from her jacket. "I want to make you a full partner in the business. Not just the equipment maintenance, but the whole operation. 50-50 ownership of everything." David stared at her, sure he'd misheard. "Mary, I can't accept something like that. This is your life's work, which is exactly why I want to give it to someone who will take care of it properly." Mary opened the folder and showed him legal documents covered in official seals. "I've watched you this year, David. You don't just maintain the equipment, you improve it. You've saved us thousands of dollars with your ideas about preventive maintenance and system upgrades." It was true. David had developed a computer tracking system that monitored all the equipment and predicted when maintenance would be needed. He'd also redesigned the workshop layout to be more efficient and suggested several equipment purchases that had increased productivity. "But more than that," Mary continued, "you and Lucy have brought something to this place that I didn't know was missing. Life, laughter, a future." Lucy came running over, her face flushed with excitement. "Daddy, Honey let me brush her mane. Miss Mary, can we take her for a ride later?" "Course we can, sweetheart. But right now your daddy and I are having an important talk." "About what?" Mary knelt down to Lucy's level. "About how you and your daddy are going to help me take care of this farm for a very long time." David read through the partnership papers, his hands shaking slightly. The arrangement would make him co-owner of an operation worth several $1,000,000. There were provisions for Lucy's education, including a guarantee that college would be fully paid for. There was even a trust fund that would provide for her future. "Mary, this is too much. I was a broke mechanic a year ago. I can't accept something this valuable." "You're not the same person who was struggling in that shop," Mary said firmly. "You've proven yourself here. You've learned everything Tom taught you and added your own innovations. This place runs better now than it ever has. But what about your other properties? Your investments? Those will gradually transition to you too as you're ready for them." "I'm not going anywhere tomorrow, David. But I want to know that when my time comes, everything I've built will continue, and I want to know that Lucy will have every opportunity in life. David looked at his daughter, who was trying to climb the fence to get closer to the horses. A year ago, her biggest excitement had been finding a quarter on the sidewalk. Now she was growing up on one of the most successful farms in the state, learning about business and agriculture and responsibility. "There's one condition," Mary added. "You keep the old repair shop. Not for business, but as a reminder. That's where this all started, with you choosing to help someone you thought needed it." "I don't understand," Mary smiled. "That shop represents the most important thing about you, David. Your willingness to do the right thing even when it costs you something. That's why I trust you with all this. That's why I know you'll use it well." Over the next few weeks, lawyers handled the paperwork while David tried to process the magnitude of what was happening. He was no longer an employee. He was a business owner, responsible for an operation that employed dozens of people and managed thousands of acres. The transition was gradual. Mary remained involved in all the major decisions, teaching David about crop planning, cattle breeding, and the investment strategies that had built the business. But increasingly, people came to David with questions and problems, recognizing him as a partner rather than just the mechanic. Lucy thrived in the new environment. She still did her homework at the kitchen table in their apartment above David's old shop, but weekends and summers were spent learning every aspect of farm life. Mary taught her about sustainable agriculture and environmental responsibility, while David showed her how machines worked and how to solve problems with creativity and patience. One evening, as they sat on Mary's porch watching the sunset, Lucy asked the question that had been on David's mind too. "Miss Mary, why did you pick us? You could have chosen anyone." Mary was quiet for a long moment, watching the cattle graze in the distance. "Sometimes, Lucy, the most important thing about a person isn't what they have or what they know. It's what they do when they think nobody's watching." She looked at David. "Your daddy fixed my truck for almost nothing because he thought I needed help. He didn't know I could afford to pay full price. He just saw someone who was struggling and decided to help. That told me everything I needed to know about who he really is." "And now we're all family," Lucy said matter-of-factly. "Yes, sweetheart. Now we're all family." David thought about that rainy Thursday afternoon when his biggest worry was paying rent. He'd made a choice to help someone, never imagining where it would lead. Looking at Lucy, happy and secure, and at Mary, who'd become like a mother to both of them, he realized that sometimes the best things in life come from the simplest acts of kindness. The old repair shop still stood at the edge of town, a reminder of where they'd started, but their future stretched out ahead of them like the rolling hills of the farm, full of possibility and promise.